Welcome to another edition of the What is Global Health podcast. Today we'll be speaking with Paul M Reeping, a current doctoral student at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. Mr. Reeping is a graduate of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health with a Master of Science in Epidemiology. At present, he specifically studies the epidemiology of gun violence and is speaking to us about the factors that influence gun violence in the United States and abroad. Mr. Reeping, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Paul Reeping. I am a second-year PhD student at Columbia University in epidemiology, specifically at the Mailman School of Public Health. Specifically, I study gun violence prevention or gun safety. It's kind of in an overlying group of injury epidemiology, but I have exclusively studied gun violence epidemiology.
Can you tell us the academic path that led you to this?
So I got my master's in epidemiology at Harvard right before my PhD. Originally, I actually was an infectious disease epidemiologist. At least that's what I thought I wanted to do. And before that, I had done microbiology. So it sounds a little strange in how I ended up in gun violence epidemiology. But I became a teacher on the south side of Chicago immediately after college. So I was a microbiology major, and I was like, what am I going to do? So I'm going to be a science teacher, which was pretty great. And I was on the south side of Chicago, but the school that I worked at actually had a lot of gun violence problems. So I had students who were killed, students that were injured. It was in the culture of the school, as in everybody knew somebody who had been impacted by gun violence, and most of my students were. So I knew I wanted to do something in public health, and how am I going to get into a program? So I did infectious disease epi, which is because I had my microbiology degree, but through my master's, I pretty much figured out that my true passion is really gun violence epidemiology, and when I applied for PhD programs, I made that transition there.
Can you tell us why gun violence is considered a public health issue?
So there's a lot of reasons I think that gun violence is a public health issue. One of them is how we think about public health is often the sort of upstream causes of disease, in this case, the disease being gun violence. So a lot of things such as education, poverty, even systemic racism, as well as other larger factors such as, like, of course, gun laws and culture around firearms has an effect on gun violence in general. So that's one way to think about it as a public health issue, is that there's a lot of things that we also think about in terms of HIV or cancer that are sometimes even the same risk factors for gun violence. The second reason is because I think it's really a public health issue because it affects the public. It's not like it's a problem that when it happens to a single person, it doesn't have an effect on the people around them. So if your brother gets shot, that can have a lot of ramifications for you as another person, and what that means when it comes to trauma or anxiety, as well as the fact that gun violence affects communities. So it's again not just the individual; it's that entire communities are impacted by gun violence, which shapes the way people feel in that community, whether or not they feel safe, and just whether in their general public health, general health. So because of increases in stress and anxiety.
And this is considered epidemic?
So that's a really good question, actually. So a lot of people consider an epidemic, but I would maybe call it more as an endemic problem, because we've had gun violence problems for a while. An epidemic implies that there's kind of one big spike and it's going to kind of eat itself away eventually. But gun violence has been just sort of endemic in the population. It's just continuing to exist. Sometimes we'll see some little spikes from here to there, but it's more of something that is kind of always in our culture, which doesn't mean that we can necessarily, we can't get rid of it. It just means that I think that instead of thinking about it something that's going to burn itself out, we actually need to do interventions to fix the baseline of what gun violence is in our country.
Can you talk about the populations affected by gun violence?
Pretty much all populations, actually. One thing that's really interesting is there's been a few studies that have looked at the difference between urban and rural populations and gun violence. So, for example, urban, as you would expect, have more homicides, so more gun death via homicides, while rural have more gun death via suicides. And they kind of actually weigh each other out. As one goes up, as it gets more rural, suicides go up. As it gets more urban, homicides go up, and they sort of cross in the middle. And that also goes for other populations. So, for example, white older men are at higher risk for suicide, for example, like middle-aged white men, while like black adolescent men are more at risk for a homicide, especially depending on the city that they're in. It's a little, I don't like to say that just that these populations have risks because of who they are. It's more of the factors and variables around them that is influencing their exposure to gun violence.
And can you tell us what some of these factors or variables are?
So, for example, I'm going to use Chicago as an example just because that is where I taught. So I had a lot of experience with students there. Chicago has, in my personal opinion, has a lot of systemic issues that go beyond, that are just extremely hard to fix. So there's a lot of poverty on the south side of Chicago. That's because of racist systemic problems from the 1950s, including like the GI Bill, where people who were not of color were able to get a mortgage for way cheap in the suburbs, which left the people behind in the city, and businesses suffered because of it. But there's also then education, because education is therefore, since education is based off often your zip code, like how much money it has is from the taxes, education suffers. And then when education suffers, of course, the people in the neighborhood suffer. And as a result, people have less avenues for success, and often that leads to crime. And it's not in any fault of the people living in the community, but rather a fault of issues of the society in which is imposed upon that community. And on top of that, there's also the issue that in Chicago, on average, there's 8 people shot per day. That's not killed, but shot. It's very, very difficult for the police department to make arrests on 8 people being shot every single day, which leads to individuals who feel like justice isn't being served. And when people are feeling that they don't have justice for their brother or their best friend being shot, often people will take it into their own hands. And again, I don't think that's a fault to the community, but rather more of an issue of the imposed constraints on the community and population, where there's just not enough resources for a lot of these people to live and become like doctors and lawyers and scientists, like many of them have the potential to be.
And you've mentioned a couple different cultural ideologies, specifically someone in a rural community who may be more likely to kill themselves, or someone in an urban community who may be likely to seek a form of vigilante justice for a wrong. Can you talk about the cultural ideologies that lead to this gun violence?
So for cultural ideologies, it's hard to say, especially for, there's a lot of different theories for why white older men commit suicide more often. So I can't really speak to that. What I can speak to in general, though, is ideologies around guns in general in the United States. So for the United States, we, as you know, we have like a deep history with firearms. And I try to keep this in mind as I do research, is that it's not just that the Second Amendment says that we have the right to bear arms, but there's a story behind it, that in the early days of the Revolution, even before the Revolutionary War started, the British heard rumors that there's going to be rebellions and then there might be a war. And the first thing that they did was that they collected firearms and gunpowder and whatnot, and put embargoes on that so people couldn't have arms in case they wanted to bear arms against the British. And there's a lot more history than that I won't go into, but that's why it basically ended up in our Second Amendment. And I think people think that that was a really long time ago, but I mean, it's generations ago, but it's not like we have a history of like Europe going back to thousands and thousands of years. So I think that ideology has been passed down, that firearms are a part of protection, and and a lot of people believe that they have the right to have it. And on top of that, I also think that in our current age of identity politics, people are choosing an identity as either they're on the right or they're on the left. And even if they don't have an opinion necessarily on firearms, if they choose to identify as conservative, they almost are given an opinion now. It's something that they take upon their identity that they believe that everyone should be able to have any firearms that they would like, or some variation of that. So I think that's sort of the biggest thing as to why people at least want to own firearms. And I think it's important to understand that when going about studying gun violence prevention. One thing that I really wish that politicians and other people wouldn't do is call it gun control, because calling anything control feels very that you're literally trying to control people, when really we're just trying to increase gun safety or decrease gun violence. And even saying the word banning firearms is a very, very controversial thing, and it's just going to jump down your throat as to breaking constitutional rights. So I often encourage people to use gun safety and gun violence prevention instead of these actually more commonly used terms such as gun control.
Can you talk to us for a minute about the risk factors of having a gun in the home?
So typically in epidemiology, I would say that the risk factor for having a gun in your home is actually having a gun in your home. So for example, we can think about risk factors for cancer or lung cancer would be like smoking. For having a gun in your home, you have an increased rate of gun death that would occur in the home. It sounds sort of obvious, but there was actually a study that came out that led to the Dickey Amendment that made it that the CDC could not allow gun violence prevention research anymore. So just having a firearm in your home also increases the rate of accidental death that occurs in that home. And this is sort of logical in a way. I mean, if you have a violent firearm that is able to kill somebody at the pull of a trigger, you might not have another object that can do the same thing in the entire home. So guns are kind of unique in that capacity. I'm going to take a quick tangent, but that's also related to suicide. So one of the reasons why guns are often implicated in suicide, and it's such a push for preventing suicide in terms of firearms, is because firearms are just way more deadly. They're a much deadlier form of suicide than other types of suicide. So for example, women are actually more likely to attempt suicide than men. However, they use forms such as poison or other forms that are not as deadly, while men, who are slightly less likely to commit suicide, use firearms. And firearms just have a much higher lethality rate, and as an effect, because men use them, then they die more often. And so this is often a question when it comes to policy making, is when it comes to firearms, people are like, oh, but we need them to prevent death, or if you don't have a firearm, the person who wants to commit suicide will find another way to do it. And that just actually isn't necessarily true, because also committing suicide is often a passionate, in the moment act. And if the person is able to be taken away from that moment, even minutes or an hour, the probability of suicide greatly decreases. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity to reduce suicide through gun violence prevention, and making sure that individuals getting a firearm, people are getting background checks, and generally they know how to handle the gun, but even more importantly, gun safety in terms of gun boxes. If they want a gun, at least storing it properly, locking it up, having the key in a different location than the box. So that's sort of a tangent into suicide, but I think it's pretty important to understand the issues around that.
Can you talk about how other countries have dealt with issues of gun violence?
So I think Australia is brought up as an example a lot because in 1996 they had a mass shooting, and they quickly implemented a lot of firearm policy, including buybacks for guns, and people claim that there it has long-lasting effects. In the literature, you'll see that it's actually sort of up in the air whether or not Australia, those gun policy laws had an effect, but that is because Australia's rate of gun death was already decreasing. But what I will say is I've recently done an analysis not yet published and with new methods, and it does appear that actually having that gun policy implemented did have a long-lasting effect on the amount of total gun death in the country of Australia. But it's really hard to think about other countries when it comes to the United States because they're so incredibly different. Certain countries, I think it's Switzerland, individuals are required to carry firearms. However, ammo is extremely restricted. So, for example, men in Switzerland, they're required to carry a gun to enter military service, and then the ammo, however, is completely regulated. And that's so if there is an attack, since they don't have like a large standing army, that they can engage their citizens. However, it prevents them from engaging in like homicide or suicide, or having an accidental death in the home. So I think that it's really just so the culture is so different around firearms. In countries all around the world, I mean, if you look at New Zealand, they had one mass shooting and they are already talking about or have passed major gun regulation through their country within weeks. And that was only one mass shooting. Of course, it was an extremely horrific one, but I think all mass shootings are pretty horrific. But they passed legislation really, really quickly. And I think that what we can learn from other countries is that sometimes not everything has to be a political issue. It's a little... You would think that it wouldn't be this way, but I truly believe that the reason why we don't move forward with common sense gun laws is because it has just become a partisan issue. And it feels as if legislation goes through for firearm or gun violence prevention, that one side lost and the other side won. And I think we need to start thinking about just what the raw benefits are for doing this. And I think also, again, changing the language to gun safety is we're never going to, in the United States, be able to confiscate all firearms. That's just not a possibility. What we can do is prevent individuals who often are called the bad guys from getting a firearm. So you can say that the good guys can have their firearms, but let's make it harder for the bad guys that are often touted in kind of conversations about guns are not able to get a firearm. And right now, we don't have the ability to do that. There's still loopholes. A lot of people get firearms throughout without a background check. People have straw purchasing where they purchase a firearm for somebody else. There's just not enough regulation. And on top of that, it's currently against the law to have a registry, a state or nationwide registry for who owns a firearm. The reason being, they believe, is if the United States were to become a tyrannous government, then they would be able to go directly to individuals who have a firearm and take them away from them, is sort of a background for why that law exists. But as a result, we have no idea who has the firearm in the United States. So right now, somebody can buy a firearm, give it to somebody else in a crime, and they use that firearm. So a lot of people say like, oh, but gun laws don't matter because people are going to break the law, are going to break the law anyway and get a firearm some way or another. But if we know the individuals who are purchasing firearms, they have to be purchased somewhere, and we know where they got them and who bought them, we can kind of put a stopgap to that. So for example, if you find that 10 firearms were bought by somebody in Mississippi and the same person and then sold on the streets in Chicago, that person could be held responsible for selling guns to people that shouldn't have them. But right now we currently have not even a registry for getting to that. So those are types of gun laws that don't necessarily prevent people who are, again, what are touted as good from getting a firearm. But it would, I think, help immensely in reducing the firearm deaths in the country.
And who do you think is most responsible for this issue? Lawmakers, manufacturers, gun salesmen, another population?
I think there's a lot. I think everyone's sort of responsible for firearm deaths in the U.S. So I think on one side, manufacturers are. You can make the same argument for firearms as you can for cigarettes. When it comes to making firearms that are untraceable, for example, or not having the safety regulations that they could because it's more expensive to add these safety features. And in a way, and at least those manufacturers, when they're required, they always push back, just like the auto industry pushed back against seatbelts forever. It just adds higher costs and to their product. I also think that politicians are partly responsible for this, specifically, again, this partisan issue and sort of actually blaming both sides for this is the identity politics, but also just introducing legislation, for example, that you are currently not allowed to sue a gun manufacturer. So if something goes wrong with your firearm, there's protections against the firearm manufacturers from being sued, which sounds sort of ridiculous that they have special treatment, but they do. But that was given to them via politicians, and that was gained through lobbying. And when it comes to lobbying, then we also have the issue of the NRA, which is a huge lobbying group with many, many members across the United States. Their goal, again, is to sell firearms, and the harder it is to get a firearm, the less firearms that they're going to sell, and the less that they are going to, less money that they're going to make. So they have a financial interest in making sure that it's as easy as possible to get a firearm in the United States. So it's sort of multi-layered. I think that it's also sort of the fault of society in general. There's when it comes to gun violence being more prevalent in impoverished regions, that's certainly because of systemic racism and an effect of both laws from the past, but also general racist ideas that were passed down through people from decade to decade. So I think there's almost everyone is responsible, which sounds sort of sad, but I think that if we're going to have any meaningful change, that we will have to really have kind of universal, I don't want to say coming to God, but a sort of coming to God moment when it comes to firearms, and that there just needs to be something done on multiple levels.
Thank you so much for speaking with us. This has been a very comprehensive look at gun violence.
Thank you.